All right, we will get started here. Couple housekeeping announcement before we get started. At the bottom, there is a chat function. If anybody would like to ask questions, there's two areas to do that. Either put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A section where they can get upvoted by your fellow attendees. If you have any technical difficulties or you just have some comments, we always love to hear feedback in the chat. We will be running a poll at the end of this. We're always looking for feedback to make sure we're answering the questions and giving you the data and the value that you need. So without further ado, welcome to Gray's Demand for Higher Education Programs. This is our community college focused webinar that we are now doing once a month that really looks at associate's degrees as well as transfer programs. Today's host is our senior partner, Steve Prost, who I will now hand off to.
Thank you, Ned. So our topics today revolves around data that's in our program evaluation system, which we call PES Plus. The data we'll be talking about is for our market data, information about jobs and student demand and competition. When you're thinking about programs, whether new programs or assessing current ones, you have to think about multiple things. One piece is the fit with the mission of the institution. Another piece is the academic standards. Everything's from DFW rates and retention and persistence rates and outcome differences by demographics, and more conceptual, are we teaching what we ought to be teaching? Are students learning the right things? And then there's the economics side of it, your margins, what does it cost to deliver a program, and how does that relate to the revenues you receive for it, whether from the state or from the students themselves. And when you're doing an assessment, you have to think about the people and the process and making that all work together. So you end up with something that's not a report that sits on a shelf, but a set of actions that you actually implement and get the results you're hoping for. Today's agenda, we're going to hit several different pieces of that data. We're going to take a look at Google search volumes, trends. We'll take a look at enrollment data. This comes from the Student Clearinghouse. Completions data. This is you're getting a sneak preview. The 2021 completions data has been released. We are in the middle of doing our cleanup and adjustments to it, but we have a preview of what that shows for programs that are relevant to community colleges. We'll spend some time working through an example program, a program of the month. We'll talk a little bit what's going on with non-degree courses, and we'll wrap up with the summary. For Google searches, what the graph shows is month by month for the last roughly 2 years or year and a half, trends in searches for academic programs. So we track searches for roughly an average of 15 keywords or keyword phrases for every program. We track that from more than 900 different academic programs. That's 900 zip codes. We track it at the county level and we update it monthly. So what you see here is the top line. What does that whole overall volume of searches look like? The big story here is since at least March, we've exceeded in 2022 the number of searches that for the comparable period the month before. This particular month, we're up 15% year over year, which if you look at it is a little higher than it had been earlier on. So that is a good encouraging trend about, if you think about the top of the funnel of students looking for academic programs and thinking about enrolling at a school. If you look at the programs that are most relevant for community colleges, what we've done here, we've taken all academic programs. We filtered out the programs where fewer than 15% of the completions are associate degrees or undergrad certificates. And by the way, this would be dominated by the big transfer programs, liberal arts sciences and studies and general studies, things like that. And so those are not shown at the top here. So when you get to the more focused programs at the top, you've got registered nursing, which is a huge associate degree program, then nursing assistant, business, cosmetology, truck driving, and so on down the line. A couple of things that are interesting patterns here. The first is a large number of these, about half of the ones on this list, are health related. Those are the ones in the lighter blue. So nursing, patient care tech, LPN, phlebotomy, medical assisting, EMT, and dental hygiene are all health programs that are very high volume in terms of searches. The others run the gamut. There's business, there's cosmetology, it's haircutting. CDL training, commercial truck and driver license, is a little tricky because those are very short programs. There's a lot of interest in them, and a lot of hiring. It's one of the few fields where people who apply for the program start getting job offers contingent on finishing it. But short term. So in terms of revenue and actual teaching load, it's very limited. Then computer science and cybersecurity, obviously related programs. So that's what's high in terms of searches for people starting to look for an academic program. Next category is enrollment. So now at the next step in the funnel. We track enrollment data in two different ways. The first is total enrollment by program. We get that by state and by academic program. And the state is where the student resides, not necessarily where the school is. In addition to total enrollments, we also get new enrollments. You can think of those as an estimate of starts. The only tricky thing with starts is that at a program level, students who are undeclared don't show up as being matched to a program for obvious reasons. The data here is for spring enrollment, and this is in associate and undergrad certificate programs. That is not a pretty picture. Down 10% from spring 2020 to spring 2021, down another 9% to spring 2022. This is not only at community colleges, but it's going to be very heavily at community colleges. So this is a trend that we see persisting right now. There's some reason for encouragement. We just saw it with the searches that this may now be leveling off. And you already have your own internal data for what's happened in fall of 2022. We're not going to have that data for a little while because the clearinghouse has not released it yet. But the trend the last several years has been bad. This was obviously COVID. This was arguably post-COVID, but the trend was obviously continuing. If we look at enrollment by program, we're now looking at undergrad certificate programs. The biggest ones are general studies and liberal arts. And again, because those are fairly general, we just left them off so as to leave the rest of the chart a little easier to read. Top one is licensed practical or licensed vocational nursing. Healthcare program, it's basically a 1 year or just slightly less than a year nursing credential. Then welding, and then business, medical assisting, bookkeeping, EMT paramedic, electrician, auto mechanics, cosmetology, and police science. And obviously the biggest of these is twice the size of the ones even just fourth on the list. So as you might expect, the big programs are much bigger than the mid-sized programs or even the not quite big programs. And general studies and liberal arts are even larger. There's an interesting thing going on in higher ed right now with undergrad certificate programs. There are increased incentives to community colleges, and this depends on which state you're in, to recognize and document offering more credentials. So for example, I believe it's in Ohio, the funding plan now says that there's a certain pay for credentials awarded, which means if you're in Ohio and you're on top of things, you're going to make sure that every time your students hit a certain point, they have earned a credential. You're going to report a certificate because that's how you can get enough revenue to survive. And so there's some growth in that we're seeing selectively at individual schools in certificates. I was just speaking with another community college earlier today where their number of awards doubled, I think in 2020 versus the prior year, because they are now documenting as a certificate whenever a student hits a certain mix of general studies and liberal arts programs that qualify for that state's transfer program. So the students are actually not doing anything different than they were doing before, but there's now a recognition that they've earned this credential, which should help their transfer, but it also helps the school in terms of documenting completion at a certain point. It does mean, however, that when you're looking at enrollment numbers in the last year or two, you need to pay a little extra attention of, is this an artifact of how it's being reported? and how the credentials are actually being awarded. At the associate level, again, we've hit in the general studies and liberal arts, which is by far the biggest associate's program. Business and registered nursing are both very large, 250,000 completions a year, degrees awarded, and each of them is 3 times the size of the next biggest program. Psychology and biology are both about 80,000 a year. So it's a very steep drop off after the top 2, after these top 2, general studies and liberal arts. Next topic is completions. What we have here is 2021 completions data. This was just released, the raw data from IPEDS about a month ago. We do an extensive cleanup of this data to try to make sure that it's more consistent in terms of how things are reported across institutions. There's some ambiguities. In business, there's 520201 and 520101, and schools use those interchangeably for general business, so we combine them. There are other things that are more esoteric. There are 2 different restaurant management SIPs, one under culinary and one under business, and they overlap considerably. They're not used exactly the same way, so we do certain things to adjust for that. And there are SIPs that have changed. Some of you probably remember about a year ago, there was a lot of press about, wow, look at all the growth in agricultural programs, at the associate level and at community colleges. And that's because that had been reported as enrollment data. What was missed was that the big change was that vet tech, which is quite a big community college program, moved from the healthcare programs in the 51 series SIPs to 8301, veterinary under agriculture. So there was no big shift in where people were studying, and there was no growth in agricultural programs. There was a reassignment of one program into a different category. So one of the things we do with our data is make sure that everything fits over time and adjusts for all those coding and taxonomy changes. The big story of 21 completions, I think, really hovers on these 2 lines, the undergrad certificate line and the associate line, which are really right on top of each other. This data shows 2012 through 2021 total awards for associate degrees and undergrad certificates. And the amazing fact about that is when you look over this long horizon, they are essentially dead flat. There is no discernible trend for these. They're not growing, they're not shrinking. You don't see the collapse of the for-profit trade schools like Corinthian way back here. You don't see the things we've been agonizing about in terms of COVID in 2021. The pattern is just remarkably consistent with these very slight blips year over year. In terms of what that means going forward, it's not a great story, but it may be better than what we'd been hearing through the grapevine. In contrast to these associate and certificate programs, all award levels, so now we're looking at these plus bachelor's, grad certs, master's degrees, and doctoral degrees, that has been growing roughly 1% a year over the last 10 years. In fact, from about halfway, 2017, call it, to 2021, those are growing closer to 2% a year, except it was flat in the COVID year, the fall of 2020. So there is overall growth that associate and undergrad certificates are not participating in. But we also have not been, at least thus far, falling off a cliff. Now, there's another piece here too. If completion rates are rising, maybe that starts are falling and the completion rates are keeping this at level. We have not looked at that yet. By the way, in 2021, then, the most recent data, this point here, for both certificates and associate degrees, that's the highest we've seen, or the second highest we've seen since 2013. Not a big difference, but it's still, the sky is not falling. If we look at associate and certificate completions, these are the biggest programs. Liberal arts and science and study, liberal arts, sciences and studies. This is the big transfer program for associate degrees. And you see it is huge compared to anything else. Business, this is sometimes transfer and sometimes workforce. And by the way, what the students actually do is not always aligned with what the spoken intent of the program is. General studies, this tends to also be a transfer intention, but the other thing this is sometimes associate degree completion. It's a way of wrapping all those credits into something you can give a formal credential for. Then nursing, medical assisting, cosmetology, vocational nursing, welding tech, nursing assistant, and then our old favorites, other. We know it's something, we don't know exactly what. So that's what's going on with completions. Big story here again is how steep that curve is from the largest to the second largest and then down. And this goes all the way down another about 800 rows of different SIPs. If we look at growth, this is 5-year growth. And the purpose of looking at 5 years is to try to smooth away those, year over year blips, particularly coming out of COVID where things can be weird. So looking at 5 years, and we're looking at unit growth. So something with a high percentage, because it's growing from 10 completions to 50 completions, is not going to make this chart. If you look at these, the first thing, the top 3, liberal arts, sciences and studies, business and general studies, they're also the 3 biggest programs. So the most absolute growth is also associated with the programs that are already big. When you get below those 3 to the next 5, the story here is these have all roughly doubled in size over the last 5 years in terms of reported completions. Esthetician, psychology, health services, allied health general. By the way, sometimes that's a transfer program. Often it's a parachute program for people who start in something clinical or with heavy in the sciences and decide it's not for them. Cybersecurity, those are all have about doubled in the last 5 years. The other one's kind of interesting in terms of that is electrician. That's also grown really rapidly the last 5 years, but that's a change in trend. That was pretty much flat for 5 years, and then it kicked up, whereas the others were more of a steady growth. In addition to positive growth, you sometimes want to look at negative growth. These are the scary stories. So what's going on here, the programs that have lost the most students in terms of completions over the last 5 years. Medical assisting, culinary arts, massage therapy, and pharmacy tech have all lost at least 60% of the students that they had 10 years ago. Those are not one-time blips. Those are part of very long and serious trends for those. I don't think it's coincidence that these programs were dominated by for-profit trade schools. If you look back 10 years ago, and many of the largest ones are much smaller than they were before. So on some level, it's not so much the program shrinking as the school shrinking or going away and taking the programs with them for these. In contrast, police science was pretty steady for a long time and then dropped suddenly in 2020 and then stayed there in 2021. It is possible that that drop, we don't know for sure, but it would not be surprising if that drop related to all the press about police brutality that was very prominent, 2, 3, 4 years ago. Some of the decline, notice a lot of these are hands-on kinds of programs. Some of that may also reflect COVID constraints. So this is the ones that have been losing share and volume over the last 5 years. There's one highlighted, culinary arts and chef training. And that's a good place to transition to our program in the month. We didn't choose it this month because it was on this list, but it's a nice way to transition to it. So for culinary arts, the key thing when you're looking at culinary arts, you want to look at the big picture for it. You want to understand the overall market, the environment you're competing in, what the outcomes are for students and where that's all taking you and how it fits with who you want to be as an institution. So we're going to start right at the kind of the big question of how does this program compare to other programs? What you're looking at here is a program ranking. There are 1,500 programs in this list. This is the very top piece of it. What the program rank is doing is looking at 4 categories: student demand, competitive intensity, employment, and degree fit. I'll explain what each of those are. And then the combination, the sum of all of those. So it's behind all of these is a score, which we'll see in a minute. And the score comes from a whole bunch of individual metrics. These are shown as percentiles. So on a scale of 1 to 100, how does this program compare to any other program you might be considering at this level as an associate or undergrad certificate program? So 100 means it's number 1 on the list. It's the highest scoring. 99 means it's in the top 1%. If there are 1,500 programs in the data set, which there are, then the top 1% is roughly the top 15 programs. Culinary shows up just 1 notch below that in the 98th percentile. So very high, but not quite as high as these. And what's driving that, you can look at the components. Student demand. This is the range of metrics around how much student demand there is. And you'll see in a moment what those metrics all are. And it ties in both the level of that and the trend in that. And this one's in the top 1%. So it's very strong student demand compared to every other program. Competitive intensity, that's in pink. That is not good. There's a lot of competition in this program. Employment, 68th percentile, that's in yellow, not great. It's actually pretty poor compared to what the others look like. And then the last piece, degree fit. Does it make sense to offer this program at this level? And yes, culinary is very common as an associate and certificate program, so it gets a full score there. So let's take a look at the details, where this comes from. By the way, just outlined with the color coding, dark green always means really good. Pink always means not so good. Lighter greens are pretty good, but not quite as good as dark green, and the blues and yellows are in the middle. And there are some things like number of competitors where a high number is bad. And in that case, a high number gets the pink and a low number gets the green. So green is always good when we do this. So let's look at student demand. I mentioned there's a bunch of metrics for student demand. Broadly speaking, we can divide them into size and growth or trend. Big picture, if you were just kind of lean back and fuzz your eyes, you'd see is a bunch of pretty dark green near size. So without having to do a lot of fancy analysis, this is a pretty big program. Let's dive into what that exactly means. There were 605,000 Google searches for keywords related to culinary arts and chef training. There's actually more than that, but we end up having to split them across. There's a few other programs related to culinary arts, though this gets the lion's share of them. Well, that's 605,000. Obvious question, is that a high number or a low number? You look over here, see 98th percentile, top 2%. So it's a very big number. Not the absolute biggest, but it's in the top 30 out of 1,500 programs. Because this is the 98th percentile, and Google searches are a strong indicator of underlying student demand, we give it 8 points in a scoring rubric. And a scoring rubric is something that's visible in the system. It's user adjustable, but generally, I prefer to leave it as a baseline at a given level for a given purpose. So the level here is undergrad certificate and associate's degree, and the purpose is programs aimed at the workforce as opposed to transfer, because you weight things differently in those two cases. So gets a lot of points for Google searches. International page views is not really relevant for a program like cooking. So then we get new student enrollments. So this is coming out of our clearinghouse data. And it says that there were 4,082 students who enrolled for the first time in the last 12 months and said that their program they were enrolled in, rather the school said the program they enrolled in is culinary arts. So this is not going to pick up incoming transfer students or stop off and return students. They'll pick up only new students. And that's 98th percentile again. And important, so give it 8 points. Completion status comes from iPads, but we do a lot of work on it. I mentioned we do some things with adjusting the zip code reporting to reflect, to try and make the data consistent across the different schools who report it and to make sure it aligns properly with our employment data and our competition data and our student demand data. We also take it and we split it between on ground and online. And for the online, we allocate that or assign it down to where the students are coming from. So if a student is taking an online program, they're showing up where they live, not where the school is. So all of you who think, as the press had it, of wow, the only schools the only programs or states that grew in enrollment when COVID hit were New Hampshire and Arizona and Utah, and I forget what the fourth was. They were looking at where the schools were. They basically were picking up the growth in online for SNHU, Grand Canyon, Phoenix, and Western Governors. They weren't picking up where the students were. We were picking up where the students were. We had much better information. That's our online completions by in-market students. Not a big thing for culinary, but on ground is very important. Here's the sum. And these are 97th percentile, not quite as high as the enrollments or the searches. But in general, we're talking a top 3% for all these metrics, except international, which for this program I wouldn't care about. The trend data, down here we have percentage trends, and there's really a mixed story. New student enrollment is pretty near the middle of the pack. 61st percentile is a little higher than the median at 50th percentile. Completion trend is down, and down, it's in the bottom quartile. Google searches are actually growing faster than that. Mixed story, I would call it bad average for trend. So high demand, not spectacular, but pretty high, and then average growth. And by the way, if you apply an average growth rate to a really high baseline number, you get high unit changes, and that's why that's dark green. You put this all together, you end up with a program, you add up these points, get 31 points, and that puts us in the top 1% of all programs at the associate and certificate level for student demand. So far, good indication. If you launch this, you'll probably find enough students. However, this is completions data, and this goes all the way to 2021, so the brand new data set. The bar, this is years on the bottom. The bars, the bottom part is associate. The top part is undergrad certificates. And you can see that it's clearly down by half in the last 5 years. And the peak was actually up at 25,000 in 2013. And we're now at a third of that. So, it's still a big ship, but it may be sinking, though it seems to be sinking more slowly. The iceberg really came around there. There's a slight shift. Before, this was associate dominant by a little bit, and now it's certificate dominant by a little bit, but it's still pretty close to 50-50. And this looks like the decline may be slowing. This is less than 1,000 completions decrease year over year, and all the previous years much more than that. So that's what we see happening on the student demand side. Employment. When you talk about employment for any academic program, whether you say it explicitly or not, you're generally looking at what's called direct preparation. I study chef training, I become a cook. I study accounting, I become an accountant. I study history, I become a historian or a history teacher. That's direct preparation. So whenever you do this, hiding behind your data set, there has to be a table that says there's a relationship between academic program and the employment data, which is generally looked at by occupation. And that's what we do as well. There is a generic crosswalk that the federal government has, the National Center for Education Studies. We don't use that for a variety of reasons. We have our own. We're working right now on, I believe, the 7th generation of that, because there are things you have to do. There's all sorts of cleanup. And you can't, right now, if the typical program matches to more than one occupation, and the typical occupation matches to more than one program, so you have to be very careful to avoid double counting to allocate things reasonably, where you've got a field that's split with several potential feeder programs. So you do all that, and you end up, if you look at something like job postings or current employment data from Bureau of Labor Statistics, those are very large numbers for culinary. 1.5 million people currently working in culinary jobs, and 400,000 job postings for those. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics does an estimate of how many job openings a year there should be based on their estimates of market growth and of turnover. They estimate something less than half, just about half of the job postings number. I look at these two together as essentially proxies for how many job openings there are. And when I see the job postings number is higher than BLS by a significant amount, here it's 2 to 1, what that probably means there's a lot of hiring going on and it's tough to find people. Because sometimes you find they're almost the same number, and sometimes you see this. One note, by the way, there are different approaches out there for how do you link job data and program data. And I mentioned the crosswalk. There are folks who talk about using skills data to do that. If you actually read what they publish on it, they say, well, we start with a SIPSOC crosswalk, and then once we have that, then we do some other stuff. So the process here is the standard one. The details of what that table looks like for the SIPSOC matching is unique. Other things going on here, tons of jobs, but the pay is terrible. Terrible in this case is an actual substantive judgment. 10th percentile wages in the market, and we have to look at national market data here, this varies by location, are $23,000 for people who work in this field, assuming they're full-time employed, which for culinary may be an optimistic assumption. $23,000 is in the 3rd percentile. So it is worse than 32 out of 33 programs. So that's a low number. And then at the average, as opposed to the 10th percentile, it's the 2nd percentile, which is even worse. So our scoring rubric penalizes it heavily for very low wages. So this is a tough one when you're thinking about it. It's high demand, but demand is shrinking, and the wages are terrible. So what do you do? By the way, down here, where it says American Community Survey, that's or we abbreviate to ACS, that's data about actual outcomes, but it's only for bachelor's degrees, why none of it is scored here. But if you're thinking about a transfer program, so not culinary, thinking about the outcomes for students in those programs is one of the things you ought to be thinking about in terms of, this is a program that's good for my prospective students. So the data we have here is what do people actually do with a bachelor's degree in X? And because there are bachelor's degrees that are awarded in culinary, we actually have wages for people with bachelor's degrees, so we haven't scored them. And their story is essentially as miserable as the BLS story is. So whether or not they go directly into these jobs and whether or not they get promoted or develop out of them and go on to grad school or whatever else, the wages still end up being very low. And this is not a field that tends to send people to grad school. In terms of the job postings that go with culinary jobs, here's the most common job titles. And here are the most common skills. And it's reassuring that they make sense for culinary. Interestingly enough, the skills include a number of management skills for these job postings. So if I were teaching one of these programs, I'd want to make sure there's at least one program in there, at least one course in the program on, restaurant management or food service management, some basics of, budgeting and purchasing and things like that. So that was the employment piece. Continuing with culinary, now let's look at competition. The first thing is how much is there? 378 schools reported graduates in this program at the associate or certificate level. That's the 97th percentile. There's a ton of them compared to the average program. And so we ding it in the scoring because a lot of competition makes your life tougher. It's hard. You're competing with more schools for those same students. The somewhat good news here is the number of campuses with this program dropped by 10 year over year. We treat that as a good sign because it means there's less competition. On the other hand, if schools are continuing to operate but dropping this program, that might be actually a bad sign that people can't make it work, as opposed to as the school itself going away. Can't really tell here. The next category, these are some of my favorite metrics, average and median program completions. Until very recently, these are my absolute favorite metrics. We now have something better, which I'll mention in a moment, but it's a separate piece and it's not a complete substitute. Average is if you take the total number of on-campus grads divided by the number of schools, you end up with 23 students in the average graduating cohort. So all things being equal, if you're an average size school, you might expect to have 23 students in a cohort. So if you're trying to judge, is this big enough to justify? Are we getting our fair share? That's an indicator. You can also look at median program completions. That's taking your 378 schools with the program and sorting them biggest to smallest, and the one in the middle had 9 grads. Much smaller number, maybe a better proxy for what you're likely to achieve. By the way, when these numbers are very close together, that makes it easier to interpret. When they're further apart, this is 2.5 times that number, means there are probably a few quite large programs and a long tail of very small ones, which, unless you're a big school, becomes a cautionary note. Other things down here, oddly enough, this was a surprise, 9% of the reported grads with a certificate or associates in culinary arts completed the program online. Kind of a strange idea. I don't know how you do cooking online, but it turns out there's one school whose name I'm blanking on, which has a program that reports about 700 graduates a year online. That's what they reported for 2020. You go to their website, they do claim it is a fully online program. So it's got, all the online coursework and, consultations, where I guess they're looking at what does your kitchen look like? So you're cooking in your own kitchen. And, what does the food look like and what do the skills look like? I have no idea what they do about how does it taste. To me, as someone who's not an expert, I assume that'd be relevant when you're learning how to cook, but, it's all a matter of what you think is important. But anyway, that turns out to be a real number, which again is reassuring when the data tells us something surprising and the facts back it up. So that's the competitive situation here. If you had asked me without looking at the data, I would have said, don't worry about online and don't consider it offering it this way. Now I might look at that and think, gee, there might be something there. The last piece of the program scorecard data is about degree fit. Does it make sense to offer this program at this level? And what we can see is nationally, and we happen to be looking at the national market, 97% of the reported completions are certificate or associates, 3% are bachelors. Enrollment shows a slightly different pattern. We're not sure why. There is a difference in the sampling between what the clearinghouse gets and what the, what IPEDS has. IPEDS has every Title IV institution. Clearinghouse is something like 96% of completions, but I believe the biggest holes are things like for-profit trade schools. So that may be why we're showing a smaller number on the enrollment piece there, that we are picking up completions, but I'm not sure. You can also see the workforce attainment here. Remember the really low wages we saw? Well, it turns out people in the specified fields, only 27% of them have a certificate or an associate degree. There's a few with a higher credential, but 2/3 of them report having no college at all. And when you have people with a college credential competing against people without colleges, that's going to pull down the wages that the college graduates earn. Other things, if you look at the pattern for this field, if you're looking at culinary, the male-female mix, the blue bars of the program, graduates, and the light blue is the population overall, basically matches the male-female split. It's just about 50-50. It also is pretty close to the demographic split. It's a little fewer white, a little more black, and you have small differences in the others, but this is probably closer to a typical demographic program than just about anything else you're likely to pull up. It doesn't skew by gender, and it doesn't really seem to skew much by race. So you put that all together, you get a program scorecard that looks like this. So here's the student demand, competition, employment, and degree fit data we've just been looking at. The overall score, if you add up the scores for the different components, was 31 points, which was 98th percentile. If you remember when I first started, this was right at the bottom of that first screenful of programs when the rank ordering. And of course, there's a description of the program too. So that takes us through our program of the month. A couple of other things. The non-degree courses, we track activity for Udemy and Coursera to get a sense of what types of courses are students signing up for and taking, because that may give you ideas for non-degree credentials or even things that may point to a program or other things to include in a program. So what we see at Coursera in August, business-related programs, we code everything that we can find on them to the 6-digit sets, and then it rolls down to 2-digit. But here's business programs with 42 million cumulative people enrolled. Computer and related fields are almost as many. Multidisciplinary, what that probably is that is the place where data science and data analytics and business analytics and other programs like that live. And those have been a huge growth area. And particularly for online, one course at a time, they're a very hot area. And so on down the line, but those are the biggest. So that's what's going on in terms of total enrollment, basically since they started offering those courses. If you subtract what they had before and look at how much is new enrollment, business is still at the top. And there's computers. So this sequence is very similar, though we don't see the interdisciplinary, which includes data science, on this list. And education and foreign languages here and here are on the fastest cumulative enrollment for them without being on their biggest. So their list is for what's big now, what historically has been big for them, overlap a lot, but not completely. That takes us through the data. So to wrap up, first thing, kind of stating the obvious, there's a lot of good data out there that exists that can help you inform your program decisions, help you find growth opportunities, help you judge whether a program is one you should be investing in. And perhaps best of all, if they give you a way when one of your board members says, gee, I think we really ought to launch program X. It's really nice to click a button on a computer, click on a couple of things, and in 5 minutes have a report that says, we could launch that, but you realize we're not going to find any students. And the ones we do find are not going to find jobs, or whatever the case may be. That ability to very nicely say, we looked, here's what the data is, and it's not encouraging, And by the way, there's someone else's logos on this, so don't blame me. I think is one of the undersold benefits of having a tool like this. If you look at the 21 completions data, and I'm focusing on that because it's really important, it's brand new. Certificate and associate degree completions have been flat now for 10 years. In contrast, total completions have been growing steadily and slowly, about 1% a year, and that may have actually accelerated recently, despite everything you're hearing about the demographic cliff. We do think that's coming, but it hasn't hit yet when you're looking at completions. The programs with the most growth at the certificate and associate degree levels were already the 3 biggest. And the next 5 biggest growers have all doubled in size. So there are programs, if you had launched them several years ago, they'd be growing now, all things being equal. And if you had picked one of the wrong ones, they could be down by 60% or more. So choosing the right program is a really important piece of identifying how you can keep your head above water in a very tough environment. And speaking of tough environments, spring enrollment, this is spring 2022, the most recent enrollment data, was down year over year. And this is total enrollment, not just new enrollment. And looking at the program of the month, the Culinary Arts and Chef Training, not digging into the specific data, but looking kind of big picture pieces. There are 4 things that struck me as relevant to programs in general. The first is that there are very few programs out there that are perfect when you look at the data. And by the way, if they're perfect, the problem means you can't afford the faculty to teach them. But that's a whole nother thing. But basically, you're going to have to do trade-offs. How do you balance high demand from the students versus low wages, or high, insistent demand from employers when you can't find students for the program? Second thing is that when you're looking at data, the programs that were dominated or where the for-profit sector was particularly strong is pulling down numbers for those programs, and that may not reflect what's happening at schools that are maintaining steady state, like most community colleges. When you look at trends, and we're still looking at data very much affected by COVID, hands-on programs may have suffered particularly. That we don't know if that means they're going to snap back or recover or flatten a new level, but we still have to pay attention to that when we're interpreting all the data. And finally, one of the interesting things about Culinary is it was really popular on TV, 5-10 years ago. There were all these cooking shows. And we know that there was a huge shot upward in demand at that point. So part of the up and down may have been driven by the cooking show fad. And if you think that's unique to cooking shows, think for a moment about fashion merchandising programs versus whatever the runway show was on TV is. There are a few others that were very big on fashion. And think about all those real estate programs and people getting excited about getting, qualified as real estate agents and so on. So there are pop culture phenomena that can very much drive enrollment up, but also bring it back down.
At this point, we have Winnell, our director of customer success, on here that will pull up some programs for you. And we do have a request and a question, Steve. The request is for 520903, which is hotel, restaurant, and food services or administration. And the question is, are we seeing these sometimes terrible results due to the lagging time with COVID, with so many restaurants closing, shutting down, hotels shutting down for extended period of time? Do you think that is having a drag on these programs? And do we here at Gray think there might be a bounce back or a potential for a bounce back?
Good question. So first of all, 520903 is hotel, restaurant, and catering management. That's one of the SIPs that gets, sometimes there's reporting confusion with 120509 maybe, but anyway, restaurant management, which tends to be used more at the associate and certificate level, and the business one tends to be more at the bachelor's and above level, but it's not completely consistent. So one of the things to be tricky when I'm looking at one of those, I tend to try to look at them both together because there's a lot of overlap if you read the descriptions. And if you look at how schools seem to be using them versus what they call that program. In terms of outcomes for that, it's really too early to know because there's a lot of lagging data. There, we all know the restaurant sector got clobbered by COVID. We know that we're hearing all sorts of stories how difficult it is to hire there now. But it turns out if you have jobs with low wages combined with miserable working conditions, it does get tougher to hire. So that may have something to do with it too. The folks who hire for those, there's entrepreneurs in that business, and then there's chains. They have different hiring patterns. I have not looked at the latest data on that, so I can't be sure exactly what's been happening, but it's the kind of thing I would be monitoring job postings data, and I'd be looking for college scorecard as the data is released to see if that tells us anything. Though actually, the caution on that, the college scorecard data is at the 4-digit SIP level. So for the business program, it's going to roll it in with all of the hospitality management, other programs, but at least it's an indication.
Well, now, could you bring up the one Steve was talking about, and let's look at maybe the scorecard?
Or yeah,
I'm going to stop sharing so you can do that one, Al.
Yep. And really quickly, I'm just going to bring up that 4-digit family before we dive into the specific program. It was actually 520903, that's actually tourism and travel service management.
Yeah, so it's 520905 is the right one for that.
Correct. And just before I dive into that program, Steve kind of alluded already to the reporting issues going on here in this program. So keep in mind, there could be significant overlap across a lot of these different versions of hospitality, admin, management in general. Steve mentioned the 12-digit SIP code that the SIP code in the 12s that we might want to consider as well. But keep in mind, I would even challenge that some institutions have different forms of these other programs being reported to this general hospitality admin management in general as well, right? But I'll open up the restaurant food service management program.
There is one question
before you move off.
The question is, how is the general one total percentile 97, and then everything underneath that kind of struggles if those sort of make up that 97? What do you think the difference is in driving that? That looks like a very good program.
We can look at the detail. There are several things going on here. The first is we're looking strictly at associate below, and most of these programs tend to report above that level. I don't remember the details. Second thing going on is student demand is going to be higher at the general one because there's just more enrollments in it. A lot more schools report to that program, but we can pull up the data and double check that. So it's just some raw number aspects on that and employment. A couple of things just while 1L has the screen up. If you notice the fifth one down, 520910 brew pub operations, that's one that's tricky. That was a new SIP for 2020. So it's in the system, but schools, generally speaking, even if they offer that program, have not changed their reporting to align with that. So not every brew pub operations program actually is reported there. Some of them will be more in hospitality management, other in places like that. And the one above that, where it says cannabis operations, augmented SIP. Augmented SIP means we created that and added it to the taxonomy to give us the ability to do things like track Google search volumes and so on. The feds have chosen not to make that its own SIP, even when schools are offering all these cannabis programs, or at least talking about offering all these cannabis programs. So there is not a place to report those cleanly now, but we are tracking it so that we can track some of the demand pieces, and eventually, the data may get more available. We'll be using it more. So if you look in the system, there's several other programs like that where there's not an official SIP, but we're trying to get ahead of the game and stay ahead of the game.
Cool. So I'll go ahead and open up 520905 here. But again, if we were spending some time reviewing this program and I got an inquiry from a client to connect to review this program, I definitely would spend a lot more time looking at relationships between your program intention and some of the other SIP codes that exist in that family. Doing deep dives into that general SIP code to see what we can find at the Google search keyword level, at the competition level, when we're looking at the entire family of programs. and we're looking at associates and below level completions, who are the institutions that are reporting completions across all of these families? Because what you're going to find is a lot of the times when we dive into a specific program like this, and I open up this competition here where we see there's 40 campuses nationally offering this program, what we find is, a client comes to the call and they're expecting to see a client that they just don't see. And there's a lot of reasons why. And usually it happens with that reporting. So in order to really get a true understanding of not just the student demand for a program, but even the competition and the employment, sometimes we need to take that macro level approach, take a step back and let the system guide us into the most appropriate zip code. But here we can quickly see, where is this program struggling, right? We're seeing some pink. And it looks like just the employment data, although we see strong job posting totals here, right? There are jobs in this field, and you might wonder, what are those jobs? We do have the ability to show you that that employment crosswalk, which will open up that direct prep relationship between occupation codes and zip codes. So we could see exactly what jobs are driving this total, but the jobs look relatively healthy in the 90th percentile. We even see somewhat above average job postings for jobs not directly related to this field, which is pretty cool to see. And then we can show you that about 18% of folks who reported a bachelor's level completion in this program ended up working directly in this field. I know the focus of this is associates and below, but keep in mind for this zip code, it looks like about 48% of completions are actually happening at the bachelor's level here, which is what Steve was alluding to earlier. A lot of the programs in this business family report higher than associates completions. Any specific questions here on the scorecard? Let me check my chat. I know we don't have too much time, so I want to see if there are any other programs you want to look at, and I'll just leave the scorecard here. If there's any specific questions about what we see in the scorecard, I'll encourage you to just send it in the chat. But I also will encourage, any questions that don't get answered here, the marketing team can reach out to us, and we can make sure that you get your hands on a scorecard, or maybe just a quick conversation about any of those questions that you have. We're happy to connect about that as well. Any other programs there?
Steve and Winnell, real quick while we're waiting, is it normal to see a correlation this different between completions and Google search, or is that rare? Where you have 89% looking at completions, but only 22% Google search volume over 3 months?
There are a couple of things going on with that. Just looking at the data here, this is national market. It's kind of an arcane SIP. Wanell, if you go to the competitor tab,
yep.
If you can pull up just for dimensions,
Yep.
SIP code and award level. Yeah, pretty, isn't that? No. Right, 6-digit SIP and award level, and just show completions. Yeah, that's fine. And now, can you add the SIP? 1205. Let's see what pops up. There's the one that's restaurant culinary, 120504.
Oh, I have a hidden filter here.
Okay. So what you can see here is that the restaurant, the 12 series one is much larger at the associate certificate level. And they're probably almost the same content, or maybe not almost. They probably are the same content because they're at the same level, very similar titles and descriptions. And Winnell just pulled up the growth trends in them. And across the smallest one also has the most negative trend. You can see that the basic story with the 12 series one is the decline is much smaller than for the 52 series one.
Mm-hmm.
What this really gets to is when you're using the system, you do want to take a look at some multiple zip codes sometimes and double check you've got the best one. And we're available to help you, have those conversations and brainstorm about them. But one of the things here, two things here. One is that when we update the system, our next major update when we roll in the 2021 data, we're actually going to be combining these two SIPs because exactly the situation. They seem to be the same content, So part of what happens when we work with schools, we've run into these things. And so every year the data gets that much cleaner because data gets cleaned by being used.
Yeah, and there's a couple more nuances as well, right? We want to be very careful. I know we looked at the percentile number. It isn't going to be like an 80%. It is going to be an 80 percentile, which is going to be interpreted in a different way here, where all that's happening here is compared to all other programs that we track Google search volumes for, there's just a lot of other programs that have a lot more Google search volumes than this one. That's really just what's going on here. So do we see that often? I can't say yes or no, but I do want to be very careful here. When we're talking about 20 percentiles worth of programs that have higher completions than this, that is going to be a very long list of programs that are stronger than this, right? It's not just 20% of programs, it's 20 percentiles of programs, which is large. So there's just a lot of programs that are a lot larger than this one in the market, resulting in stronger Google search volumes for others and less Google search volumes for this one. Another way to look at it as well.
So considering I don't see any other questions here, I think we can wrap up. Once again, everybody, thank you. Everybody that joined at first stayed through the entire webinar, which I always really appreciate.
Cool.
So next webinar, October 27th, for the community colleges. And please check out our blogs and anything else. And if you ever need help with academic program evaluation, please do not hesitate to drop us a line. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Ned, is the next one the 27th or the 26th?
Sorry, 26th for community college, 27th for the bachelor's and above. Thanks, Steve.
Awesome.